Now, Monitor brings you Meet the Press, the prize-winning interview program produced by Lawrence E. Spivak, ready for the spontaneous, unrehearsed conference of four of America's top news reporters. The questions do not necessarily reflect their point of view, but may be their way of getting a story for you. Ned Brooks has joined the panel, so today, here is the moderator of Meet the Press, Lawrence E. Spivak.
Welcome once again to Meet the Press. Our guest today is Mr. John L. Lewis, for close to 40 years, President of the United Mine Workers of America. Mr. Lewis was again on the front pages when he appeared before a House Labor Committee and blasted the Kennedy-Irwin bill. The packed committee room was testimony to the fact that after 50 years in the labor movement, he is still listened to with high interest and regard. Now in his 80th year, Mr. Lewis is still the unchallenged leader of the United Mine Workers. He is still a figure of controversy in the labor movement. Mr. Lewis founded the CIO and became its first president. In 1942, he broke with the CIO, but later returned to the AFL. In 1947, he again left the AFL. Under his leadership, the coal miners rose from economic prostration in the Depression to a basic wage of $24.25 per day and achieved the fattest welfare benefits in labor history. And now seated around the press table, ready to interview our guest, are Clark Mollenhoff of the Des Moines Register-Tribune, Mrs. May Craig of the Portland, Maine Press-Herald, A.H. Raskin of the New York Times, and Mr. Ned Brooks of NBC News. And now, Mr. Lewis, if you're ready, we'll start the questions with Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Lewis, when you appeared before the House Labor Committee, you opposed all of the pending bills for the further regulation of labor. I'm wondering whether you would also favor the repeal of all the existing laws, including the Wagner Act.
The question is hardly applicable because it's obvious that the Congress will not be able to give attention to a schedule as broad as you portray there in this Congress. And it would be begging the question to advance argument now in behalf of those more or less theoretical objectives that you state.
Well, if we were to eliminate all federal regulation, isn't it likely that the states might move in with legislation more repressive than what you have now?
That would depend, of course, upon the rapacity of the corporations and the large employers of the country as to whether or not their policies would superinduce such a demand.
You've said, Mr. Lewis, that the real purpose behind these pending bills is to abolish unions. Do you think that Senator Kennedy, who professes to be a friend of labor, is really out to destroy unionism?
Mr. Brooks, that is in part the purpose of not all who promote this legislation, but of many who do. The substandard employer, the oppressive employer, the sweatshop employer, the employer who is on the perimeter of our economy in the sense as between prosperity and financial disaster. That takes in the labor-baiting, anti-union combinations of
Senator Kennedy doesn't fit into any of those classifications, does he?
Senator Kennedy has said that the bill is the best that he could get through the Senate.
But you don't
after his original form was amended.
But you think the best one would be none at all.
I think it'd be much preferable not to have any legislation at this session of Congress of the character proposed rather than to accept. The Kennedy bill is now amended.
Would you accept Senator Kennedy's motives as being good as far as the welfare of labor is concerned?
I do not question Senator Kennedy's motives because long ago some philosopher said that the search for motives was the most elusive task in all the world.
Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Lewis, in your appearance before the House Committee, you expressed some rather flattering thoughts and sentiments with regard to Mr. Jimmy Hoffa, a man about whom certain people in the Senate and the United Labor Movement as well seem to have a great many reservations. Do you regard him, sir, as a coming John L. Lewis type in the younger school of labor leaders?
Mr. Raskin, I don't think that your word flattering statements or compliments is quite in order. I replied to certain questions about Mr. Hoffa, interrogatories addressed me by the members of the committee. I said that Mr. Hoffa had not been convicted of any crime. No felonies lie against him. And that if he was as guilty as some of his critics say, why wasn't he proceeded against in courts of competent jurisdiction and proven guilty of them?
Mr. Lewis, I believe, however, that you also said that you didn't have the slightest doubt that if the members of the Teamsters Union had an opportunity to vote on his retention, that they would vote him into office and vote him in by a very substantial majority.
That is precisely correct, Mr. Raskin, and I'd like to reiterate the statement again without repeating it and emphasize it. That is my judgment.
Is that in the nature of a Gallup poll statement, or does it reflect a certain admiration on your part?
A little experience, a little knowledge, a little observation, and it sums up into an opinion that I hold that the Teamsters Union, the members thereof, who are the beneficiaries of the virtuous work of the Teamsters, will gladly re-elect Mr. Hoffa to president if they have a chance to vote for him.
Well, did you say virtuous work of the Teamsters, Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
I wonder, is it the virtuous record of Mr. Hoffa and his associates, or is it rather their capacity for thumbing their nose at public opinion that appeals to you, sir?
Anytime Mr. Hoffa is able to negotiate a contract that means higher wages and better conditions and more privileges for those engaged in his vocation, I call it virtuous, Mr. Ruskin.
Well, Mr. Lewis, your own union, of course, has a very distinguished record, not only in bringing home the bacon, but also in building hospitals. The Welfare Fund, of course, the most remarkable institution, one that has accomplished a great deal of good. Do you feel that bringing home the bacon in the narrow sense of wage and hour gains is an adequate justification and motivation for a leader of labor?
That bacon can never occupy a narrow category of importance, because bacon may be used as a generic term there, and mean bread and butter and shelter and medicine and education and a future for the children of the Teamsters. So it's not a small accomplishment to bring home the bacon in the broad sense of the word that I intended it to mean.
Mrs. Craig.
Well, Mr. Lewis, did you attend any of the hearings of the McClellan Committee?
Which committee?
The McClellan Committee.
As I search my memory, Mrs. Craig, I'll have to answer in the negative. I have not.
Did you read it, any of the testimony?
Whatever the newspapers chronicled.
Well, weren't you shocked and horrified at the arson and the dynamite and the killing and the coercion and the sweetheart contracts that was revealed there?
No more than I was shocked yesterday or the day before.
About what?
When I found that a government agency in Denver for 14 years had 200 employees of some division of the Department of the Interior on its payroll.
But as a labor leader, you're not responsible for the general morals of the labor. You are responsible for the general morals of labor, but not for government,
and Mrs.
sir.
Craig, as a leader of labor, or one of its spokesmen, I'm not responsible for the morals of any part of our population.
Well, don't you think the time...
You're getting into the area where now the moral code is involved, and the question of sin wholesale or in an individual sense.
Sir, you brought in the government, and I'm saying that as a labor leader, you should be concerned with morals in the general labor movement if you expect to have public sympathy, which I find is declining for labor unions, and I'm a labor union member.
I thought that's being looked after by Reverend Graham and the various representatives of the churches, the question of sin and morality, and that the hunting down of sin and morality and its eradication was not an enterprise within the purview or the province of labor unions, and that the members of those labor unions didn't pay in their money, whatever it may be, for their membership, to have it used for that kind of a purpose.
Sir, we have had the Reverend Graham on here, but he's not on here today. What I want to ask you is, do you know that the general public is losing its public sympathy for the labor movement with strikes in hospitals and strikes in defense plants, arson, murder, dynamite, murder down in the Kentucky coal fields
you
not
make that
long
an
ago?
averment. Perhaps you know more about it than I do, but I do not accept that as a premise.
I have found it so.
Because 15 or 16 million of that public that you talk about belong to labor unions.
How many?
And they're not in revolt against the morality or the sins of their leaders. And among the 70 million who would like to be gainfully employed in this country at the present time, I doubt if you can find any similar signs. Now, if you want to tell me that the millionaire publishers of our metropolitan press throughout the country are enraged and to some degree hysterical on the subject and are uttering daily pronouncements, I'll believe you. I'll believe you. Because their interests lie, some of them, in the weakening of labor, along with the big employers of this country, and along with those who have other access to ground. But when you tell me that there's a revolution in public opinion in this country on this subject, I'm telling you it's a papier-mâché revolution.
I don't think so, Mr. Lewis.
Well, it's a free country. I bet that, Mrs. Craig.
Mr. Mollenhoff.
Mr. Lewis, while you were before the committee a week or two ago, you said that during all those years, your early years in labor, I occupied the proud position that Jimmy Hoffa occupies today. Now, do you really think that that's a proud position in labor?
Have you any sense of humor at all? Enough to consider
Well, this was meant. I'd like to get this squared away then, Mr. Lewis.
A facetious reference to a proud position.
Mr. Lewis, I'd like to get this squared away then. There's been Mr. Hoffa, and his Teamster magazine has put the blush on this, that the great John L. Lewis has been praising Jimmy Hoffa and is behind everything that Jimmy Hoffa stands for. I'd like to get down to just a few things.
I'm not concerned with the misinterpretation of my words, either in Hoffa's magazines or in any metropolitan newspaper.
Well, I would think you'd like to get the record all straight on just a few little things. Now, how
Are
about...
you testifying or asking questions?
I'm going to ask a few questions of you.
Very good.
And if you will answer them, why, we might find out what you stand for.
Well, I can't say in advance. I may be incapable of answering them. I'll have to wait until you utter them.
Do you approve of the hiring of burglars, narcotics peddlers, extortionists, and the like for union office? Now, this is precisely what the McClellan Committee has showed that Jimmy Hoffa did. Do you approve of this?
My dear sir, that's the question which is an offense to any man when you ask him a question of that kind.
Well...
And I decline to answer that kind of a loaded question and have you try to build up, then, a comparison which you think would be invidious as affecting myself and any other criminal you want to name.
No, this isn't a matter to reflect on your own union, Mr. Lewis. This is just a matter of asking whether you believe in the hiring of convicted extortionists and burglars, something that's clearly on the record. And I would think that if you felt like wanted to go on the record now, you could say you don't approve of that.
Well, Mr. Mollenhoff, if you'd been an if you'd been an observing critic, My record in the organization I'm honored to represent is a complete answer to your interrogatory, and it needs no emphasis from me.
Well, Mr. Lewis, I'm wondering whether are you afraid to criticize Jimmy Hoffa? You've been very forthright in criticizing other union officials around the country.
I'm neither.
Walter, Reuther, Meany, you'll say anything you want to, but you never say anything. Are you afraid of Jimmy Hoffa?
I'm neither afraid of Hoffer nor you.
Well, I'm not in this. I don't have the
you
clout
are in
Hoffa
it.
has.
You're injecting yourself in it.
I'm asking you whether you feel free to
The question of my courage isn't involved here, but I think it'll be ample to get me through the evening.
Well, isn't this about the first time that you've ever failed to criticize a major labor official?
Why, that's another one of those simple questions that's based on absurdity.
Well, you've criticized Meany, haven't you?
Is this the first time I've ever failed to answer a question?
Well, you've criticized Meany, haven't you?
I've what?
You have criticized George Meany
I've
and
not
Walter
only-
Reuther.
I've not only criticized Meany, I criticized another fellow in public life one time. And hordes of his associates.
Well, why won't you say one bad thing about Jimmy Hoffa in the light of the record? Or why haven't you studied the record
Because
if you haven't?
all the forces of the law, the government, supported by the press, the Justice Department, the Special Committee of Congress, the Internal Revenue, have all combined to try to convict Jimmy Hoffa of something which they have failed.
He's been
And
convicted
under
twice,
our
Mr.
law and
Lewis.
under our Constitution, Jimmy Hoffa is a free-born American citizen.
Mr. Lewis, he's been convicted twice, just for your information. But do you believe, you're quite a realist, I understand, from your operations over the years. Now, you know what the effect of political contribution
Gratifying
by
to have.
labor unions is, don't you?
Highly gratifying to have your opinion of me.
Well, Mr. Lewis, you recall the testimony of the $20,000 paid to a judge down in Tennessee
No, I do not. I may have read
by
the
a
headline in
Teamsters
the
union,
paper.
a payoff in a case. This is what happens to law enforcement. Now, I wonder what you think about political contributions to law enforcement officials by labor unions.
Anything that's happened of an illegal or immoral character among the membership of a local union has also happened among the employees of government in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party, in the Prohibition Party when we had it.
Well, Mr. Lewis, wouldn't you be critical of that, though?
Oh, from a moral standpoint, I stand for the elimination of as much sin as is possible among human beings.
Well, aren't you?
But I'm not working at that job of abolishing sin, Mr. Spivak.
No, but don't you condemn the wrongs in the labor movement and the wrongs of labor leaders? Don't you think that as one of the great and outstanding leaders of your time, this is something of importance for you to do?
I merely offer in record the records of the years of my own organization as an evidence of what we believe in the United Mine Workers of America.
Well, is there some reason why you've criticized every other labor leader but not Jimmy Hoffa?
Yes,
May we have it?
because I don't join the mob every time it hollers stop thief and pursues a man down the road and turns the pack on him. And that's what's being done now. The pack is after Hoffa, and they haven't got him yet.
Mr.
And
Rask,
I'm not doing any running with the pack on this occasion because he's entitled to have his chance under our flag, under our law, and an equal break before his peers.
Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Lewis, may I switch from the pursuit of sin for a moment to talk about the affairs of the labor movement? The steel companies some months ago joined with the commercial coal operators in giving the members of your union a wage increase of 25 cents an hour. The steel companies, as you know, are now negotiating with the United Steelworkers of America and have taken the position that in those negotiations no wage increase is appropriate. Do you have an opinion on that particular situation, sir?
Well, that raises the question of why the steel companies and the president didn't object to the $2 a day wage increase in the bituminous industry, which became fully effective on April 1. And then object to any increase in the steel industry before it is ascertained how large or how nominal it may be. And thereby a great question is being raised in the country. The steel industry undoubtedly has some problems. It has the very definite problem of replacement on a modern basis of plant equipment and facilities. It's subject to a 52% corporate tax on its net earnings. And the amortization it is enabled to charge off on obsolete plants isn't sufficient to purchase, to build and construct modern replacements or expansions. So they do have a problem. And the only place they can get the new money to do so is out of higher earnings. Now,
I'm sorry, sir.
Instead of asking for whatever was merited in the form of tax relief, they've undertaken to impose on the workers in the steel industry a freeze in their wages. And for the first time in 6 years of his administration in the White House, the president has departed from his proclaimed policy and interfered in a labor dispute before even the negotiations were conclusive on any point, thereby throwing the great weight of his prestige and influence on the side of the steel magnates and against the workers in the steel industry.
I'm sorry, sir. It is true, however, that the price of steel has gone up about 88% in a period when the price of coal has stood still. Don't you think that might be a relevant consideration?
Those are true, but they do not run to the question now is before the country and the steel industry. The president bases his opposition on inflation and his fear of inflation. But in effect, what he's telling the American workman is that you cannot participate in the advantages of the economy on the same basis as the employer, because when we fear inflation, you have to have your wages frozen. And he eliminates that part of the population from the participation in the advantages of free enterprise and capitalism and our way of life.
Our time is running short. Now let's have short questions, Mr. Lewis, if you can, shorter answers. Mrs.
Mr.
Craig.
Lewis, Jimmy Hoffa's talking about a general strike. Would you back up a general strike in this country?
I never have. I have no present plans to do it, Mrs. Craig.
Well, then, can't you answer yes or no?
Well, I can answer yes or no to saying that, in the first place, he denies that he said that
There's a record of it.
Oh, yes, I'm quite sure
Tape
that
record.
the opposite side would have a case on that. But our best statesmen use that device constantly, don't you know, every day.
He used the word primary strike. It's the same thing.
But a general strike in America is an absurdity. And it isn't possible. Because men don't strike unless they have reasons to strike. And anybody who doubts that can go out in the street and tell a few taxi drivers they ought to go on strike and see what they say. God knows they need improvement, but they're not going on strike because somebody tells them to. They'll decide that themselves someday.
Mr. Mollenhauer.
Mr. Lewis, you've been able to pile up a lot of money in your union funds and so forth and invest them in various ways, including, as I understand it, in many of the coal enterprises, loaning it to the coal enterprises. Do you think there's any problem for labor here as a conflict of interest if you get too much money over into that area?
Well, whenever there comes a point where a representative of a union can't decide where his duty lies and his loyalty lies, I think his members ought to get rid of him right then. I've never had that trouble myself.
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Lewis, in past years you've had some experience in politics, perhaps most notably when you supported Mr. Wendell Willkie for president in 1940. I'm wondering if you're going to have a candidate in 1960, one whom you prefer.
I'm wondering the same thing.
Would you care to tell us what your thinking is along those lines? Who might be your choice?
It hasn't crystallized.
Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Lewis, do you feel, as some labor leaders apparently do, that automation is going to mean a period of twilight for our mass unions?
Mr. Raskin, you put your finger there on a very large subject that I think that I could not undertake to analyze in the time we have left.
Well, could I simplify it by just...
It's an important question, I grant you that.
Could I just pinpoint it in this sense? Do you see a John L. Lewis coming along who can do in the white-collar field what you did in the mass production industry?
Modesty permits me from answering that question, Mr. Raskin.
Short one, Mrs. Craig.
I wanted to know if you would accept compulsory arbitration as a means of avoiding violence in the labor movement.
No.
Mr. Brooks?
Not now, not tomorrow.
You said at various times, Mr. Lewis...
Compulsory arbitration reverts to the slave conditions that prevailed in the Middle Ages.
You'd rather have killings?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I see our time is up.